Welcome back. This is the Constitution series sponsored by MyStraightTalk.com. Today we're going to take a look at the historical context from which the Constitution came. These are very important concepts for us to understand, and it's also important that we understand what our history teaches us. For instance, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, a man named George Santayana, a very popular philosopher, wrote these words: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." I think you're going to see today how history is repeating itself in the 21st century, just like it did in the late 17th century and the 18th century of the American Revolution. America began with migration to us starting in 1607. Of course, we all know, or should know, this is Jamestown. But the Jamestown experiment was an utter failure. Jamestown, the men came there just to seek riches. They spent all of their time looking for gold, oysters, and other things that would provide them riches. They had heard so much of the Spanish conquest of Central and South America and the riches found there that they were expecting to find the same thing here. Jamestown was a failure. The real migration to America began in about 1619, 1620 with the Pilgrims, who came to what is now Massachusetts. It continued on with the Quakers and Presbyterians from England and Scotland, the French Huguenots coming from France, of which my family descends, the German Lutherans, and yes, the Jews began coming to America in 1654. All this was because they were wanting to escape religious persecution by the king and the governments of Europe. It's very important that we understand this, that in the 17th century, there was a concept among the monarchies of Europe, including England, that was called the divine right of kings. It was also called Rex Lex in Latin, which meant the king, Rex, is law, lex. So when we look at this, we find that the king, whatever religion he was established and cemented into the place of divine protection from the king in whatever country they lived. Now, most of these kings were of Catholic descent, and thus the Catholics had supremacy among the European monarchies. That's not to denigrate the Catholics in any way, it's just a statement of fact. And as a result of these Catholic kings, the Protestants, those who rebelled against the Catholic teachings, starting in the Great Reformation, which began in the very early 16th century by Martin Luther, were persecuted, killed, tortured, tormented, etc., along with, and primarily starting with, the Jews of Europe. They were all persecuted by these Catholic monarchies. So in the 17th century, they found a way of escape, and that was to America. And they have founded these colonies that have now become the United States. Part of that great migration, they came here seeking religious freedom. That's very important for us in the 21st century. They came here to be able to freely practice and freely express their religious faith without fear of governmental persecution. That's why the Pilgrims came. That's why the Quakers came. That's why all the Protestants came, the Lutherans, the Huguenots, and the Jews, primarily to escape religious persecution. As we continue on down, we find that in the 17th century, in 1644, a Scottish Presbyterian minister named Samuel Rutherford published a book called Lex Rex. Notice how that is changed, that is flopped from the other one. The divine right of kings was Rex Lex, but yet Reverend Rutherford published a book called Lex Rex. In Lex Rex, he stated that the law, or the law of God, is king, and even the king must submit to the law of God. Well, needless to say, Reverend Rutherford spent many years in prison as a result of his heretical teachings. His health suffered dearly, and even though he was released from prison eventually, he died very shortly after that as a result of the disease and the ravages on his body from the imprisonment by the King of England. Needless to say, that king was James II, a Catholic monarch of England. It also is important to note that James II is the same king who brought about the Protestant rebellion of the 1670s and 80s, which ended with the British or the English Bill of Rights of 1689. Now it's important, let's take a look at some of the claims that the British, or some of the items that were established in the English Bill of Rights of 1689. Whereas the late King James II, by assistance of divers evil counselors, judges, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the Protestant religion and the laws and liberties of that kingdom. Point second, by assuming and exercising a power of dispensing with and suspending of laws and the execution of laws without consent of Parliament, by committing and persecuting divers worthy prelates for humbly petitioning to be excused from concurring to the sad assumed power. Interesting, the king did not enforce the laws passed by Parliament. Sound familiar? Another one item from the same English Bill of Rights says that by levying money for and to the use of the crown by pretense of prerogative for other time and in other manner than the same was granted by Parliament. The king redirected funds appropriated to him by the Parliament. He took those funds and did other things with them. I think we see that in the government today, by causing several good subjects, being Protestants, to be disarmed at the same time when papists were both armed and employed contrary to law. The right to bear arms is here mentioned. Another one was by violating the freedom of election of members to serve in Parliament. He rigged the elections and only allowed those to be appointed to Parliament that he wanted, the king. Another one, and whereas in late years, partial, corrupt, and unqualified persons have been returned and served on juries and trials, and particularly divers jurors in trials for high treason, which were not freeholders. In other words, he allowed people into political office which were corrupt. Maybe this is a lesson we should learn for today. Again, reminding us of the words of George Santayana. Those who do not learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat its failures. We have not been taught, we have not learned, and we have not discovered our true history. And as a result, that history is repeating itself in the 21st century. There are many things that we're going to discover in the coming days and weeks where I'm going to bring up historical references and historical examples, which we will find almost parallel identically the government in Washington, D.C. of the United States of America. We're going to find things that, lo and behold, and I'm going to give you the proof of it, not just say these things out of hand, but how the government in Washington, D.C. more closely resembles the Parliament of the 18th century than it does the Constitutional Congress of the late 18th century. Remember, I'll say it again, those who do not learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat its failures. So, I ask you to stay tuned, and I look forward to speaking to you tomorrow on more of the history, more of the things that led us to the Constitution, You can find out more information on this subject at mystraighttalk.com. That's again, all one word, mystraighttalk.com. Thank you. Have a good day. I look forward to your questions and comments in the coming days.